Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening,
Namaste.
everyone. Good evening, Smriti ma'am, Roli ma'am, Shweta ma'am, Anurag sir.
Good evening, everybody.
Namaste, ma'am. Good evening.
Namaste, Nisha ji.
Namaste, ma'am. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good too, ma'am. Thank you.
I'm glad to share that today is 99th episode of CC Friday. And we will be celebrating the 100th episode of it on 6th of December. Okay, till everyone join in, I would like to share my screen. Just a sec. Good evening, Himanshu ji. Anushka ma'am, good evening. You are from which branch?
Good evening, ma'am. I'm representing educational initiatives.
Oh. Yeah. Himanshu ji sir told me about that. Yeah,
Yes.
welcome to today's episode.
Thank you.
Till everyone join in, I would like to ask everyone a question. I hope all are there in front of their screens. If yes, please raise your hands or give me a thumbs up or something. Yeah, thank you, Deepti ma'am. Yeah. So my question to is, if you could have any superpower, what you would have done? Yeah. Anyone would like to answer? Vibha ma'am, Akanksha ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Good evening.
I
I was
hope you heard my
thinking.
question.
I heard your questions.
Yeah,
That
yes,
is
ma'am.
why I was thinking first immediately the thing that came to my mind was कि मैं कहीं घूमने बिना किसी फ्लाइट के और बिना किसी शिप के चली जाऊं.
Yes, ma'am.
This was very first thing that came into my mind. Then all of a sudden I realized कि there can be something else also with what we are daily struggling. क्योंकि घूमने वाला तो हम ऐसे भी जाके घूम सकते हैं. But we
Absolutely.
are actually struggling with something like हम हर रोज हमें बच्चों का ट्रस्ट चाहिए, बच्चे सुने हमारी बातें, and lots of effort we are trying to give for getting all these things in our control. So I thought कि कुछ सुपर पावर से यही कर लेते हैं कि बस हम बोले वही हो जाए.
Great, Vibha ma'am. Thank you so much for sharing. I request everyone to please switch on your camera if possible. Yes, I request you to please switch on your camera. Thank you so much, teachers. I guess we have around 100 participants. Himanshu ji, we can start our session.
Right, ma'am. Thank you so much. Namaste, everybody. Thank you all for joining. And Anushka from our team will today be hosting the session. So over to you, Anushka. Wishing you all the best.
Thank you so much, Himanshu, and thank you, ma'am, for that activity. Actually, it was really nice to hear everyone's superpowers. Someone wanted to go back to their childhood and wanted to travel. So, of course, amazing things to hear always. Let me just quickly share my screen and then we can begin. So, uh, is my screen visible to everyone? All right. Thank you, Nisha ma'am, for the reaction. Great. So let's begin. So before we actually delve into this session completely, first of all, thank you everyone for joining at this hour for this session with me. And I hope that by the end of this session, we go away with some insights, something that we can take back to our classrooms. So one request that I have from all of you would be that if we can make it interactive, I would really love for me to hear all of your voices. If you could come off mute and share with me as and when we discuss the session together. So, with that being said, let's begin. So, I have a very small activity for all of you. So, if you could just take 30 seconds and grab a paper and a pen or a notebook, anything on which you can draw. It would be a very small activity. So, if we can arrange all of this before we begin, I will take 10 seconds here for a pause and then we will move ahead. All right. I hope we all have something to write on or draw on for this activity. Moving ahead, I want you to think of an image of a scenery. We have just 2 to 3 minutes to do this activity. So, what would you do if you were asked to draw this image of a scenery? And I would like you to take this time and draw that scenery. Imagine anything in your mind and take the next few minutes to draw the scenery on the sheet of paper that you have. Since we do not have a lot of time, let's spend 20 to 30 seconds on this. And please give me a thumbs up once you're done. I hope some of you have drawn the scenery that you've been thinking about, or even say a dream vacation, which we were talking about earlier. So let's move ahead and see. This is what really a scenery looks like usually. This is what we've seen for most of our time in the classrooms, for most of the time as children. And this is what we see our children also drawing most often. So now I would want you to observe here what are some of the things that can be seen in this image. Take a note, there are mountains, there's a sun, a road, a river, a house. And then moving ahead, I would want you to see and observe for yourself that does this image of this scenery match your own drawing? I would want you to go back to your own drawing and have a look at was this something very similar? Were there any key points which were like key images which were drawn by you as well and that you could see in this scenery which I had shown earlier? Would anyone like to come off mute and share if there were any similarities or probably even the differences in your drawing and the one that you saw on the screen? I'm sorry, since I'm sharing my screen, I will not be able to see the chat box. Uh, would anyone like to come off mute and share it with all of us?
Smriti ma'am, your hand was raised. If you want to say something, you can unmute and say.
Yes. Good evening. Good evening, Anushka ma'am and Himanshu
Good
sir.
evening, ma'am.
Actually, here I would like to say that yes, one thing is similar in my scenery, that is sun for sure.
Okay.
But the other things which I drawn, it is a little bit different from the scenario I have shown just now. So I have one waterfall in my scenery, one luxurious house, one car, and a garden where my kids are playing.
All right.
Yes,
A similar kind of a setting, just probably in a different way.
yes, you can
All
say.
right. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing that. Anyone else who would like to share?
Nandita ma'am, I could see your hand also. Pallavi ma'am, if you want to share, we can unmute and share.
Yes, ma'am. The same picture even I have also drawn at mountain and few birds are flying and over
Right.
there clouds are also a little bit hovering there. Birds are also there. I drew a tree and
Mhm.
beside the tree I drew a stream running by it. It's
Right.
almost the same. The first thing that came in my mind was mountain, and I want to I want to spend my holidays. Even I was thinking about having a vacation in the winter also to go for a mountain.
So I think that's what came alive on the sheet
Yeah,
as well.
exactly. That came inside my mind.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing that.
Thank you so much.
I think we have one more response, do we? All right. So I think we can move ahead if not. So if we see that in both the responses, the setting was really similar. What we were seeing in the image that I had shown earlier, and probably for most of your drawings as well, would be very similar. So the idea here is, and what I have been meaning to do with this exercise is also that are we really doing the same in our classrooms? And this is not specifically to your classroom, but in our education system in general. So if you see, our minds are trained to think in particular ways. Sometimes that may limit our creativity and for us to think out of the box. But the question really that we need to ask here then is that are we encouraging our students to think broadly? Or are we wanting them to condition themselves to the same kind of a thinking that we are doing to all the other students? Are we all creating a journey, a classroom where all the children are thinking in the same manner, answering in the same way, the correct way that we want them to answer? Or are we really pushing them to think and really problem solve, critically analyze and look at the problems that we are seeing in the world currently, or the kind of education system and the reform that we are also hoping for in the coming years? And that is what is something that we will be going to discuss in the session today as well. So let's see and try to find answer to some of these questions in the session today. That how can we probably bring our children out of this rote memorization or this continued journey which we see students to be constantly engaging themselves in. So I'm here to talk today to you all about competency based education. So, before we begin on this, would any of you like to share with me of what your understanding is about competency based education? Or what do you feel, or what comes to your mind when you hear this term together? Anyone who would like to share their response? We can take one or two responses if anyone would want to come off mute and share it.
Uh, Dipti ma'am, I can see your hand is raised. If you want to
Yes,
comment, you
yes.
can
Good
unmute and.
evening, everyone. Good evening, Anushka ma'am, Hemant sir.
Good evening.
Competency when comes, one thing click in my mind, application.
Right.
When you need to apply your knowledge, that means competency based.
Hmm. Right. Application is one core part of what we will be talking today as well. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing that.
Thank you.
Anyone else who might have a different response?
Something that involves some skills.
Right. Skills come to be one of the main ideas of what competency based education completely talks about. So I think building on that, thank you, ma'am, for sharing that. Competency based education really brings the focus on mastering specific skills or competencies throughout the curriculum. So typically, we would spend our time in the school, say we dedicate a certain time for say 1 week for a particular topic or a subject that we are going to study in the classroom. But when we when we shift our focus on competency based education, we want the students to master a particular skill. The time, the curriculum does not pay a lot of attention to it. Then our majority of focus comes on to, are my children mastering a particular skill? Are they progressing towards the knowledge of a particular concept? And that's how we build up on the education that we provide to our students. The focus is then not on the time that we are giving on a particular topic, but rather, are my students really learning? Are they understanding what we are talking about? And will they be able to apply that knowledge in an unfamiliar context as well, which we will be discussing further as well. So, over here as well, for competency based education, there is no one size that fits all. Every child might have a different skill which they might be good at, which they would want to work upon. But for us as teachers, as leaders, the idea is to identify which are those skills where we would want to work with our students, and then which are the skills which my students are really good at and can progress on further. And through that, then, can we teach them certain concepts and topics so that they're not memorizing what we are telling them, but if they're really understanding and applying that knowledge in further aspects as well. So once we look at competency based education, there are four key areas which we really talk about. One of them is student centered approach. Over here, we would want our focus to shift from teaching to learning. The At the center of it is our child, is the student, where we need to look at what is his or her need, what is the pace that this child learns on, what is the learning style that this child might have, because as you all might know, each child has a different learning style. In a classroom of say 40 to 50 students, all of my students would have different needs, different skills which they might be good at or might want to work on. And hence the idea is to bring the child is at the center, bring their interest at the center, and then plan our teaching and lesson accordingly. And with that, we want them to master certain competencies. We want them to progress in a certain way so that whatever they have learned, say in grade 4, it progresses, and then they are able to apply the similar skills in different concepts as well. So, all these competencies, which we will be looking at further as well, have a direction to it, have a flow to it as to how they progress. And it's not about moving through the content, not about finishing a topic and then moving on to the next one, but to make sure that the child has mastered that particular concept. And then it is a personalized learning plan. It tells you exactly where the child is at, what are some of the differentiated support that you can give to your children, because for each of your students the needs might be very different, like we talked in about first student centered approach. And hence we would want to take a differentiated support for our students, which we will be looking at and discussing with the key principles for competency based education in the further presentation as well. And with that, meaningful assessments really form the core of it, because for us to understand that if our children have really understood a concept, if they've really learned, and if they will be able to apply that knowledge elsewhere as well, we want to assess that, okay, has my student really understood what I was trying to teach them? Was my learning outcome met? Was my objective with the lesson met? And hence, it becomes an important tool to understand if my child or if my student has really mastered the particular topic that we've been talking about. So, let's now dive into the four key principles of what competency based education looks like. At first, at the heart of it are the learning outcomes that we need to bring our focus on. This is the one of the first key principles that we have, and all the teaching that I do in my classroom hence needs to be aligned with the learning outcomes that I have planned for the school, for my class. So even if you see here on this slide, these are some of the learning outcomes which the NCRT has designed for English language. Now, for example, in class 4, I want that my learning outcome is that the child infers the meaning of unfamiliar words. One objective here, which I could be doing in my classroom regularly, is that I want my students to learn certain word meanings, certain new words, and use it in an everyday practice, and then apply the knowledge during reading comprehension and other areas as well. But my objective cannot be that, okay, I want my students to learn these particular word meanings. Because at the end, at the core of it, what you really want for the child to be able to do is to understand the meaning of an unfamiliar word. And if you say that from class 4, it progresses towards class 5, with the child being able to use synonyms in that particular word for in a particular context. So if a child is able to infer the meaning of an unfamiliar word, only then they will be able to understand what a synonym is, what could be some possible similar words which could be applied in this particular context. And hence, it becomes important for us, if you see for class 6 as well. After synonyms is when the child will learn antonym. This is the progression that we will see in our classrooms as well. But the important factor here is to understand that are my learning outcomes aligned with what I'm teaching in the classroom as well. Because if we move ahead and see how we are assessing, it is important that only if we are teaching a particular in a particular way towards a particular learning outcome, only then I will be able to assess that particular outcome or a skill with the children. So, for example, over here, if we see for class 6, this question has been asked where the child had to replace the underlined word in the given sentence. The context is there with the entire sentence for the child. They have to apply a synonym to it. And when we looked at the last slide with the NCRT learning outcomes, this is a skill the child should be able to learn by class 5. And hence, they should be able to solve this question for class 6 as well. But over here, when we see for the national performance on the same question, not majority of the students have been able to answer it correctly. Would any of you like to share why that could happen? Anything that comes to your mind that why was it that the children were not able to answer this question correctly? All right, I think if there are no responses, we can move ahead because probably the child here did not look at the context as such. I think there is a response on the chat. I'm not able to see it.
Ma'am, may I?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Ma'am, maybe because of limited vocabulary.
Limited vocabulary, okay, but why do you think that could be a possibility? Because over here, if we see in the question, the context has been given and the child has to just apply that knowledge for that question.
Maybe, ma'am, the child couldn't understand the use of called off and then he could not relate it.
All right, right, that could be one reason. And in fact, what we have been talking about for learning outcomes as well, there could be a miss between was that particular child or were these children studying in the same way in the classroom as well? Because these are the learning outcomes which we want to align with our teaching plans as well. So building on to that, what we've been talking about competency based education as well, there's always two sides to it. There's competency based teaching, and then there's competency based assessment. So with the teaching comes my plan for the class, my lesson for the class, the way I teach in the classroom. So if I am not aligning my learning outcomes with the plan I have, with the teaching I am doing in the classroom, it will be difficult for me to assess the children on the same. But why do we really need to assess that is also something that we will discuss later as well. And now, if you look at this grade 8 question, previously when we looked at the learning outcome slide, antonyms was a skill which class 6 child should be able to understand and should be able to apply. However, even if you see here, the national performance on this question has been really low. And if you look at it, the question is testing the exact same thing which the learning outcome on the previous slide was talking about. So the idea here is to understand that I need to align my learning outcomes. I need to teach accordingly, and only then I will be able to assess my children accordingly. Now, this assessment becomes important because then we can identify that where are these certain gaps? Where is this support that I can provide to my students? And this is an example from a grade 6 science textbook. So if you look at it, it's a very direct passage given in the textbook. So any of you who would like to share that if this was something that you had to teach in the classroom, what kind of an objective could you have? What could be the learning outcome that you could have? I think in the interest of time, I will move ahead. Meanwhile, I would really appreciate if the discussion keeps going on in the chat, and I would love for me to go back to it and then visit it later. But for this particular paragraph, the idea is for my students to understand how a circuit works. Now, is this enough really for me to build a competency in my students? That, okay, if this is, if the bulb is connected in a certain way, and if the circuit is closed, the circuit will work. But are the children really able to understand it just through this one paragraph or example? Over here also, if you see, there is another example, suggested experiments that can be done with the students. But the focus really needs to come on, as a teacher, what is my learning outcome with this particular concept? What do I want my child to learn? And that is how I will plan my lesson as well for me going ahead. For example, if you see this question, even if we are adjusting the position of the bulb and the cell, does it change anything? This will then further tell us that has the child really understood the core concept that we were trying to teach and not just what was given in the textbook. So even if we see here of how the performance has been, a very small amount of students, a small percentage of students were able to answer this correctly. Because it is important for us to master these progressions, for us to align these particular outcomes with whatever we are teaching in the classroom. Moving ahead, the second skill, the second key principle that competency-based education talks about is mastery-based progression. So we have 3 questions here. All 3 of them are grade 3 math questions. What do you think the performance would have been like for these 3 questions? For say question number 14 and question number 24. What percentage of students do you think would have been able to answer it correctly?
Ma'am, may I?
Yes, please go ahead.
So I feel that question number 14 must have been answered correctly by quite a few students.
Right.
question number 17, maybe around 40% students must have answered correctly. And question 24, very less students.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing that. But I have one more question for you, if you don't mind. Why do you think that only, say, 40 or like 20% would have been able to answer question number 24 correctly?
Yes. Question number 24 involves some higher order thinking,
Right,
right? Because the total, if you see, is 4 and there is a blank box and you can already see 3 and 1. So the child might
right,
feel that 3 plus 1 is already 4. So what do I fill up in that box? So, you know, it
right,
requires some higher order thinking, and that's why maybe some students may not be able to answer.
right. Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing that. Building up on that, like ma'am also shared, question number 14 is what usually the students would do. It is in a very familiar context, the kind of questions that we usually provide the students with. But as you see in question number 17 and 24, it progresses. So question number 14 will inform me, the performance will inform me that my students know how to add. It is not that they are struggling with the concept of addition. But as we move ahead and as we progress in this particular concept and skill, are my students able to really do it? And hence, it becomes important for us to understand that my students need to master and progress in a certain concept rather than just moving on from one topic to another. And that is how we will really build a competency and a skill, because we need to progress, we need to test ourselves, challenge ourselves constantly to be able to apply that knowledge. And even here, the child, if we see, maths is a typical example of it, that children usually understand the procedural knowledge. They will learn the procedure of how to do whatever sum they're solving, but are they really spending time on the process, about how to reach that journey, about how to take from one level of a question to the other? And that is that comes down to us as teachers and as leaders, that are we mastering our students in a particular concept or a topic? And hence it becomes important for us to come down to why, like why is it that my student was not able to do this, and what is that certain skill in particular that I would want to work on. One another example here is of reading comprehension and literature. So this is one report of one of the schools, and reading comprehension and literature really go hand in hand. So if children have really not mastered the skill of reading comprehension, they will struggle with literature as well. So if you really look at the skills which we talk about for reading comprehension, for example, to identify how the character is feeling, what are the characteristics this character has, or to understand uh, where this setting is, what the beginning, middle, end of the story can be. If we are not able to apply those skills, it will be difficult for us to really comprehend what the text is talking about. And of course, then we will see the results of that in literature as well, because students are very used to answering questions like, what is this character saying? Where is this character going? Because then it becomes easier. You find the right word wherever it is described in the paragraph. You straight away jump to that, go to that particular part in the passage, and then you write your answer. But have I understood it? Have I been able to apply that contextual knowledge into different kind of questions that are asked on the paper? And hence it becomes important for us to master a particular progression or a concept for me to be able to apply that knowledge in different areas as well. Important principle for competency based education is having clear and measurable competencies. For example, if you look here for this question, what is it trying to test? Like, if this is a question about shadows, was my thought or my learning outcome only that I want my child to understand the directions, to understand where the shadow will be formed? Or would I want my child to have a deeper understanding that how does the movement of sun affect of how where the shadow would be formed, the length of the shadow that would be formed? And hence, but how do I really measure it until I have a clear and measurable competency? For example, we were discussing about English earlier. If I say that my objective would be that the child will be able to appreciate the poetry that the child is reading, but how do I really measure if the child will be able to appreciate it? But now, if we shift that focus towards skills like identifying, that the child will be able to identify how the character felt in this setting, that is something that I can measure. I can tell that my students have understood about a particular concept. And hence, without having clear goals, it will be a risk because we will be misaligning our teaching and assessments, which will further lead to confusions. So even if you see here, not majority of the students were able to answer it correctly because until I haven't taught according to the learning outcomes I have, until I have progressed and made sure that my student mastered those particular concept with clear and measurable competencies, my students will not be able to perform in the assessments as well. And that is why we look at it as a cycle. Whatever I will teach with my learning outcomes aligned is what my students will be able to perform on as well. So over here also, if you see, this is a question from a very familiar context, a very typical kind of a question which you will find in textbooks as well for science grade 5, where the students have to tell how three states of a substance would look like within the same area. Now, majority of the students were able to answer it correctly. But that does not mean that this question is really irrelevant because it tells us that the foundations are clear. My students understand that how molecules will be packed in a certain area. But was it enough to build a competency and to understand if my child has understood the concept? Not really. So if you look at these two kind of questions, a very similar concept, a very similar topic being tested. However, as we move ahead with the kind of questions being asked, the performance really declines. But here it is also important to look at, if you look at the question on your right, question number 16, majority of the students for say in the second row have gone with option 4, which is sand, salt and sugar. Now the kind of options here that we are giving to the students is also very important because it clearly tells us where the gap is. Where is it that we would want to work with our students on? Because it may not be important that the entire topic is such that we would want to revisit, but probably there's a certain skill, a certain concept where the children are struggling with, which you would want to revisit and support the children with. And very same concept being tested again in grade 9. And as we move ahead, then the gap continues. The gap then further increases because the child has not been able to master a particular skill or a concept at a lower grade. And hence, it will continue to increase as and when they move forward as well. But we've looked at a lot of data and we've talked a lot about we need to support our children, we need to tell them, and we need to work with them. But how do we really give this support until we know that where our students are? But is the highest score always the better? Is one question I have for all of you. So there are two reports on your screen, one on the left and one on the right. These are of two different schools. So now I would want you to bring your focus on just section A performance. Which section do you think performed better? In school A, which is on the left, or in school B, which is on the right? Anyone who would like to share? In which school was 8A's performance better?
Ma'am, I think it would be section A, because what I can see over here is the procedural knowledge, that is more in A section rather than in the
Right,
this one, the second one. The understanding is there, but procedural knowledge is less.
right. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing that. Anyone else who would like to share? All right. Like ma'am also shared that over on the left image, the procedural knowledge was much more than on the one on the right. But I would like you to bring your focus towards these two graphs at the bottom. You see on the left hand side, the highest score for section A is 9, but the lowest score over here is 1.5. And when you look at the right, the highest score is 7.5, which is lesser than the one as compared to the other section, other school. But the lowest here is 2.5 as well. So if you see the variation between the student who has performed the highest and the one who has performed the lowest is really high. And that does not tell us that, okay, this class is performing better, because my lowest child still is standing at 1.5. And I would want that this gap should be reduced between the highest and the lowest. And hence, we want to focus on this variation rather than bringing our focus towards that my child, my student, or my class should have the highest scoring mark or highest scoring child. And hence, this also tells us that there's a variety of students in our classroom. Each learner is at a different level. For each of these children, you would want to give a different support. But over here, the focus then really needs to come on, my goal should really come on that my lowest performing students should move ahead. My class average should move ahead, rather than me focusing on my highest performing child should be performing better.
Vishal sir, if you can
And
mute
hence,
yourself. Vishal sir, if you can mute yourself, please.
thank you, ma'am. And if you see here as well, so this is one of the schools where we worked with, and we tried working around competency based education and for the teachers to shift their approach towards learning outcomes and mastering of concepts. And as you see, the focus shifts. If you see from grade 8 to 9 to 10, these are same set of students who were observed for the 3 years, and over the years they have progressed. So probably the highest score has come down, but if you really see on the left, the score has moved towards the right. So the child in my class who has performed, who the lowest performing child if was at 1, which is 10%, the child has now come to 40%. And that is what I would want, that all my children should move ahead together. So for that, my focus needs to come on where the variation is. What kind of different learning levels do I have in my classroom? And how can I reduce that gap so that all my students are mastering the concepts that we are talking about? And then it becomes important for me to strategize and look at the data very clearly as to which are certain concepts which I would want to rework with my children on. For example, over here, if you see, this is a report for 3 of the sections, but there were few questions where all of the sections really struggled with. Now, I would really want for myself to go back to this one question and see what was in this one question. Was this a particular skill? Was this a particular concept which my child was really struggling with? And through that, I present to you the fourth key principle of competency based education, which is timely differentiated support. We want to support my children, but differently for each of the student in my classroom. But we've been talking about support, but how do I really provide this support? Now, practice is something we often talk about, that practice will make things perfect. If there's something which you're lacking on, practice and it will get better, especially with maths. But practicing will improve the familiarity with the kind of questions. But what if I'm practicing the wrong way? What if I'm practicing only one kind of question? Will that really improve my skill? Will that really make me master a competency? And hence, it is very important for us to practice perfectly, for us to be able to support properly. Now, this is an example from a grade 6 maths textbook. And let's just take an example. For example, one of my students, Misbah, is really struggling with the concept of fractions. And I tell her that, Misbah, go back, practice these 15 questions, and probably you will understand this concept better. Now, Misbah goes back and practice these 3 questions. Over here, for say in the first, she writes 2 upon 4. In the next one, she again counts the shaded part, writes the number on the top, and below it, she writes the total number of pieces divided over here. Same for the third one. But what would really happen when this question is then presented to her? The one on the right. What do you think Misbah would answer? Anyone who would like to share?
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening, ma'am.
Ma'am, I think 1 by 4.
1 by 4. Any reason why?
Ma'am, because she calculates total number of the boxes in the previous figure. So total number of the boxes in this figure is also 4. And that's why
Right.
she takes 4 as a denominator.
Right.
May I?
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
So here, she might get conditioned in the classroom that, okay, I have to count the parts which are shaded and the parts which are not shaded and directly arrive at the answer without
Right.
putting any logic into it.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing that. And I would really like to bring everyone's attention to one word which ma'am shared, that conditioned, right? Because I've been practicing these kind of questions all throughout. And now there's a pattern which is formed inside my head, that this is what fraction looks like. I did not understand that fractions need to be divided equally. And hence, it will be difficult for me to answer this question correctly because I will only see it as 1 by 4, which is how majority of the students also performed nationally on this question. And then root causes, any guesses, anyone who would like to share that what could be the root cause of it? I think
Ma'am,
one which
actually,
is
the
really
root cause may be
sure.
the beginning when the fraction has been taught. It is not clear to the students mostly that fraction is nothing but the part of the whole, and we cannot take fraction without, assuming in the equal parts. So here in this
Right.
particular question, the parts are not equally divided. So that is the
Absolutely.
reason why maybe she might have mistaken in this. And nationally also, children make mistakes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing that. And like we've been looking at other questions as well, for maths specifically, the child really mastered the procedure. They solved the worksheets, they practiced the similar kind of questions, of course, in a very familiar context. And hence, they applied the same knowledge here as well. But over here, once when I look at this data, do I understand that how will I then need to support my students? How will then I work around with my students in the classroom on which particular concept? A very similar kind of a question for the same concept. And again, a very big, large amount of students, percentage of the students who answered this exactly as how they answered the previous question as well. And this is a very similar concept which is given in the NCERT textbook as well. The example here is that there are four children sitting together, and they have 5 apples which they want to share. Now, how are they going to divide? And this is one question where I would like to bring your focus towards, similar to what this example was, which we were talking about from the NCERT. Over here, 23 1 by 19 is what the child had to infer, that what would it be same as. Which option do you think majority of the students would have went forward with?
C.
C. All right. Any reason why?
Option C.
Sorry, I could not hear that.
Ma'am, may I?
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Ma'am, because if there is no symbol in between this, then by default, I think the student will take the multiplication symbol.
Right. Because again, this is what they've learned in operations, and then they're applying the same knowledge, and over the time, they're able to use the same as well. But if you look at here, like option C was what majority of the students went with. But then it becomes important for us to revisit concepts like such, examples like such in the classroom. It is not necessary that the child is struggling with the concept of fractions entirely. But this one particular area, this one particular skill is where we need to work with the child again. And that is why it is really important for us to align our learning outcomes, to identify that what would be the learning outcome, what is it that I want my child to understand and retain with what I'm going to teach them in the classroom. But moving ahead, it is really important, as we have looked at so much of data, it is really important for us to look at this data closely and probably also bring it in our classroom, bring it for our teaching practices. Because this is how we understand where the gap really is. Where is it that I need to support my children? Because if, say, fractions was a critical topic for my class, for my school, I would not have the time, or I would not want to revisit the entire topic, but I want to identify what was that particular concept where the child was struggling with, and hence revisit only that particular topic in the classroom as well. This is one of the studies which was done by EI some time back, and we really wanted to understand how students think. And what option do you think, looking at this question, would the students have chosen? This is a class 4 question for measurement. Do you think that the students would have been able to
They could have chosen
guess
4
the correct?
because the
4.
lower scale is showing 4.
Okay. Surprisingly, in fact, majority of the students were able to answer this correctly, because the starting point of this pencil was where the starting point of the scale is also. However, with this being answered correctly, we could assume that my child now understands what length is on the basis of the result of this question. However, once we move forward and once we really check with a different kind of a question, say shifting the pencil to a different length, will now the students be able to answer this question? If you really look at it, over here, 77% of the children chose option C, which was 6 centimeter. Again, because here they're only looking at the end point. With such questions, with such options that we give to the students, it becomes really important and a key insight for us to look at as to what is it that we really need to work with our students, and hence integrate such practices in my regular teaching practices as well. Because here, with the previous question, we could see that understanding is not an issue, but once we shift the perspective of the question, is the child still able to apply that same knowledge or not? And if you look in such questions as well, all the options given for A, B, C, and D, they've been very well thought of. They all tell a particular misconception or a particular gap in a child's understanding, which they might have. And that is where you would want to strategize and work on. But that is what data does to us. That is how data helps us. So, to really revisit, these were some of the key principles that we had discussed for competency based education. It becomes firstly important for us to align our learning outcomes, because unless I'm aligning my learning outcome with my plan, I will not teach it in that way. And unless I'm teaching it in that particular way, it will not be possible for me to assess my children on the same kind of questions. So it really comes together as a cycle, that we align our learning outcomes and walk in with that mindset, that what is it that I want my child to really learn here. And second, we want our students to master on the basis of the progression. We do not want them to just move from one concept to the other, but really retain what they are learning and master the skills that we're offering to them. And have these clear measurable competencies, which tells us, which gives us the data that have my children really understood what we've been talking about. And then it becomes important for us to give that timely and differentiated support, because for each child, these skills would be very different. Where they are at would be very different. And then to take data-driven instructions accordingly. So now, if you really look at this, this is how the shift in the conversations, shift in the mindset would look like for students. The focus right now is really on the goals, that am I succeeding? Am I capable? But with the competency based education, we would want the shift towards that, am I improving? Because improvement, growth, how much I've progressed is what the focus really comes down at. For teachers, bringing the shifting the focus from what are my students weak in class to really understanding where my class is at. How can I support? What can my support look like for my students to excel or progress in a particular concept? And as we move forward, you all must already know CBSE has also introduced 50% of competency based questions in their curriculum, and hence in their questions as well. And hence it becomes very important for us to bring this shift in our daily teaching practices as well, because it cannot be fair for our students to perform and go in the exams straight away in class 10th and 12th and answer the questions which they have not prepared for, which they have not worked upon, or the skills they have not built over the years. And hence, it's really important for us to shift towards competency based education. Now, the national curriculum framework also talks about the same thing, that the focus really needs to come on competencies and learning outcomes. And outcomes then further define your competencies. So, at the basics of it, at the foundation of it, is really, what are my learning outcomes? What is it that I want my students to learn? But what does competency based education look like? As per CBSE's website as well, it really brings down the focus on the design of the curriculum, bringing in more real world example and context into the classroom, shifting the idea of teaching and learning in the classroom by empowering the students, the student centered approach that we began our conversation with. And assessments would then form the core of it, because we want to understand that have my children understood whatever I've taught to them. But why do we really need to assess? First is to improve, to remediate, to support wherever we can, to identify where we need to support as well, to inform our practices. Once we know that, okay, this is where the gap is really at, these are the skills that I want to build, those are the kind of decisions also then that you will make in your school or the classrooms. So then it would be informed practices which you will be using in the classrooms or the schools ahead. And then to prove, because the data will give you those insights, it will inform you, it will prove you that It's not an assumption that I'm making that my students have learned this concept, but I have the data right in front of me telling me that my students have mastered a particular skill or a concept. And hence, at EI also, we use this particular cycle where we are testing our students as to identify where are the gaps really at, where my focus needs to come on, and then target on those specific skills and areas where the students are really struggling with. And then it leads to transformation. But after transformation, really, it does not stop. We again need to test that have my students really mastered the concept, or again where the gap really is at and which could be worked upon. And hence, data really helps us to improve the learning process of our learners. With that being said, because we had a limited time today, we could not really delve deep into learning outcomes and how to design these learning outcomes. But again, I would be very happy to do another session with all of you on the same. With that, we come to an end of today's session. I would really love for you to share any thoughts you had on today's session, any key takeaways that you had, and that you'd like to share with everyone. Thank you.
So, ma'am, I'm currently teaching fractions in grade 3 and grade 4. I will definitely ask the question about apples now. So, thank you for that.
That's very nice. Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing that. Anyone else who would like to share?
Yeah, ma'am, may I?
Yes, ma'am, please go ahead.
So, ma'am, I'm an EVS educator. So, my key takeaway is, I will be introducing variety of questions to my children so that, they are not used to solving a particular kind of problem only. And moreover, I will be focusing on what they've learned. Are they able to apply it in unfamiliar situation also?
Right.
So, thank you so much for sharing
Thank
the
you so
insights.
much, ma'am.
Thank you.
I hope the session comes out well. All the best for that.
So, ma'am, one thought.
Yes, ma'am.
One thought that I had was that the language development of the child will affect a lot. I mean, the understanding of the question will be affected by his language development also. So, I mean, I felt that many questions, they are like they require proper language understanding. So maybe the child is good at math, but if he is not understanding the English, then his score will be affected.
Right. But I see that a lot of subjects in that manner are also very interconnected. So once we talk about maybe say integrated education, there are no really concepts which you can bifurcate or which you can separate that this is only math or this is only English. For some cases, I understand that the questions might be difficult for the students to understand. But again, because they're very used to solving some questions in a very familiar context, it might become difficult for students to look at a question which is asked very differently. But are then the students spending enough time with it? Are they engaging with the text enough for that to happen?
Also, Vrunda ma'am, to add on to what Anushka just mentioned, I think it's a vicious cycle. So, until and unless the right questions are asked, the English teacher will find it difficult to actually pinpoint what the weak areas are and treat them accordingly. So, until the quality of assessments will come to a certain level, finding the gaps, whether they be it English because the student is being able to find it difficult to understand the word problem, it's difficult. So once I think the level of question increases across all subjects, we'll start seeing the changes.
Right. It is a very regular practice as well. Again, perfect practice that we need to work on then. Thank you, Himanshu.
Okay, thank you, teachers. I'm sharing a feedback form in the chat box. Do fill it. And thank you for joining in today. Just a sec, it will be there in the chat box within a second.
Hello, Ashwini ma'am.
Yes, sir.
I am extremely sorry. बीच में थोड़ा सा अनम्यूट हो गया था.
Okay. No issues, sir.
Sorry.
Teachers' feedback form is shared in the chat box. Do fill it. Thank you, Anushka ma'am, for the wonderful
Thank you
session
so much.
and a lot of takeaways. I can see teachers asking you questions. It was amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Himanshu ji, for arranging the session for today. And thank you,
Well,
teachers, for joining in.
thank you so much,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
Thank you so much, Anushka. Wonderful session.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for being so interactive and for answering all my questions as well and participating enthusiastically. I really hope that this was helpful. Thank you and take care.